Hello, I am Arthur Melman, a member of the East Hampton Group for Good Government and chairman of the town's Airport Management Advisory Committee. This is the second of our shows on the airport, its operations, its finances, and its future. With me today, we have two other members of the town's Airport Management Advisory Committee. To my right is Gene Oshrin, who is a longtime aviator at the East Hampton Airport. He restores and flies vintage aircraft, and he is a member of the executive committee of the East Hampton Pilots Association. At the far end is David Gruber. David, too, has been involved in airport matters for many years, primarily in the interest of noise reduction. David is a lawyer, an investment banker, and is now writing his thesis for his PhD. In our first show, we reviewed the airport generally. Gene took us for a flight from Montauk, circled around, and came back over the airport. As he was landing, he was showing us the various features and buildings of the airport, the industrial park, the hangars, the terminal, and the various runways. We also reviewed the finances of the airport, and we found that the airport is productive of revenues and does not use any real property tax dollars to fund its operations. However, we learned a very important additional item, as this pie chart will show you. During 2015, this little tiny sliver, this purple sliver here, was the amount spent on maintenance of this major facility. Clearly inadequate, and as a result, there have been various lawsuits brought against the town to improve the condition of the airport. Today, however, we're going to spend most of our time talking about the pavements of the airport. And Gene, as a pilot, can you tell us a little bit about the condition of the airport pavements?
Well, the pavements, as of today, the most recent maintenance on the runways have been to the main runway 1028, which was reconstructed, I believe, in 1998.
Well, Gene, before you even go any further, I'm going to ask you to take a look at this very pretty picture of the main runway, and it seems to have all these cracks and patches and so forth on it.
Well, the problem with the main runway and the two secondary runways is that they haven't had any maintenance to speak of since they were originally paved. And the lack of maintenance has allowed cracks to develop. Through the winter freeze, the cracks fill and expand, and they're long overdue for maintenance now. The main runway being in the best condition of the three. One secondary runway, 422, was closed in around 2007 due to the fact that it was so badly deteriorated. It was a liability problem, and the town chose to delay maintenance on it, and it has not been used since that date as a runway, but has been maintained or repaired as a taxiway.
Well, one of the things that's happened as a result is there's been a lot of litigation at the airport, some about noise, but also some about the condition of the facilities at the airport deteriorating. We have a chart which we're going to use in the subsequent segment, which really tries to illustrate all the various lawsuits going on at the airport about noise, about conditions, about fuel pricing, and so forth. But I just want to call attention to this one, this third one on this first page of the litigation chart, which really is a list of problems at the airport. The pavements being one, the lack of a deer fence that's effective, the various problems with the airport that we hope are being addressed now at this time. I'm going to flip through these charts relatively quickly.
That was quick.
very quickly.
Yeah.
Litigation goes fast, and we all know money for litigation goes even faster.
Arthur, before you go on, can I just ask Gene to clarify something that maybe
Sure.
the audience doesn't understand? We refer to the main runway as 1028. I'm not sure people understand what those numbers mean and why it's called 1028.
Oh, here, why don't we just
All right,
turn around here, and we can point to the number 10, and up here is, you can't see
I'm
it.
probably blocking the view of the picture, but the long runway, the main runway, 1028, the numbers signified the magnetic heading of that particular runway. Runway 10 is oriented at 100 degrees magnetic.
Oh, so they drop a zero, basically.
They dropped a zero basically for ease of radio communication. So when someone says that they're landing on runway 28, it's a heading of 280, which is almost directly west.
Good. Okay, now what we're going to do, David, we have on the screen a picture of the pavement areas at the airport, and one is dark purple, and you just want to tell us what these various areas do and what they're called?
Well, what you see, the main feature you see when you look at this is a big triangle, and those are the 3 original runways as built back in the 30s. And the reason that you have runways in different directions is because the wind changes direction. And a pilot always wants to be landing into the wind or taking off into the wind because that keeps your airspeed down. Obviously, if you're going with the wind, you're going to be going very quickly. So there are 3 runways originally in order to accommodate changes in wind direction. The one that Gene described to the left, sort of pointed from the lower left to the upper right, that's the runway that's currently not in use as a runway. It's in use as a taxiway. The east-west runway is the main runway, and then we have a secondary runway for wind conditions.
So I think it's important to note that the reason that the runway David referred to as being used as a taxiway is the condition was so abysmal that planes couldn't land on it.
Yeah.
And then, ironically, even as a taxiway, it was so abysmal that the conditions were such that if I took a jet over them, I may suck some of the pavement, crumbling pavement, up into the jet. And we just want to give you an idea of some of the conditions that were allowed to deteriorate at the airport over all these years when there was money for it, but so much fighting and disputation about what was supposed to be happening at the airport.
So the blue areas that you see, those are taxiways. Those are used, obviously, for access to the runways to get from the ramp area, which is that sort of big pink area you see up on the right, or from hangars. There are small airports, many in this country actually, that really consist only of a single runway. Don't even necessarily have taxiways. That's the one thing you have to have as a runway. But it's undesirable if you have any volume of traffic to use the runway for taxiing because you have interference between planes that want to take off and land and people moving around on the ground. So then if you have enough traffic, you build taxiways so that movement at the airport doesn't interfere with flight operations.
Now in our picture, David, it looks like there's a piece missing which connects the 2 blue taxiways, which I know has been on the drawing board for a long period of time. Gene, you want to just explain to us why that piece is useful? It would be nice to have it yesterday.
With the different types of traffic that you have now, large jets, small aircraft, single engine, twin engine, when they're taxiing, the way to expedite traffic is to have as most direct route as possible. Originally, taxiway A, which is a taxiway you say is missing the piece in the middle, was originally intended to be completed as a straight-through taxiway. For various reasons, there was objections on the basis, I believe, of environmental concerns that an endangered weed had been found. So the original project was stopped, and as a result of that, traffic had to use the secondary runways as taxiways.
Okay. Now, my understanding is we're going to build that piece at the airport this year, or coming year, 2017. Now, if we go to the next chart, we have a chart which shows the condition of the various parts of the airport. And green is good, yellow is fair, or, yeah, I guess it's fair. And what they're really telling us is we should be aware of letting our fair areas get worse or our green areas get yellow. What we see here is that the main runway is green at the moment, thank goodness. And then we also see that in the left-hand side, there are lots of lines on this secondary runway. Can you just explain what happened there, Gene?
Well, the condition of the runway, which had the longest period of non-maintenance, deteriorated. The aircraft using it as a taxiway, the jets, which have rather expensive engines and can ingest debris, and could possibly cause the town considerable liability as far as replacing engines. So the part that is, I believe, gray
or black, yeah, it's green. It's hard to see, but there's a part that was gray on the outside and green on the inside.
That was repaved to a width of 35 feet, which was the worst condition of that taxiway, so that it could still be used as a taxiway until the time when the decision is made on which runway will become the secondary runway. Yeah. I might add that when this airport was designed and built in 1936, aircraft were considerably different. There were mostly tailwheel airplanes. DC-3s, which used the airport, were tailwheel airplanes. Tailwheel airplanes are somewhat, lesser used now, although a lot of private airplanes, small airplanes like the kind of aircraft I fly, still have tailwheels. But that triangular configuration is fairly common in older airports that had runway surfaces that were wider. East Hampton Airport actually was 200, all the runways were 200 feet wide, but they were compacted gravel. It wasn't a real pavement. As equipment evolved, airports were more likely to have one runway or two runways. The FAA, if FAA funds are involved, the FAA will only fund a two-runway system.
David, do you want to just take a second here and explain to our viewers what this FAA funding is, and is there a big pot of money there?
Well, it's a big pot of money, but the FAA Airport Improvement Fund is generated by fees that passengers pay at airports. If you look at your airline ticket closely, you'll see that there are a bunch of fees tacked on the bottom. Mm-hmm. Some portion of those fees go into a big pot of money that the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, administers, and that money is then used to build and maintain airports all over the country. So it's a big pot of money, but it's maintaining JFK mm-hmm. and O'Hare as well as being used for some smaller airports. And in the past, East Hampton has applied for and received FAA grants for some of its project expenditures.
Now, you said maintain runways. So if I want to fill in some cracks this year, I could get a grant for that?
Actually, that's probably a bad choice of words, because ordinary maintenance is something that the airport's obligated to do. It is actually not fundable by the FAA. The FAA funds capital projects, which could be either construction of a new facility or a major rehabilitation. And this has actually been one of the problems around the country, not just at East Hampton, is that a lot of small airports have played a game in the past where they shirk their responsibility to maintain the pavements, allow them to deteriorate, and then would apply to the FAA for a major rehabilitation grant. And that way, they would avoid spending the money that they really were supposed to spend locally and ultimately get the FAA to pay for it. So now the FAA has rules against that. The rules say you're not supposed to do that, but in fact, it's not well enforced, and there are plenty of airports that play this game, and I think East Hampton did too in the past.
Well, I think what's interesting also is when we talk about maintenance and condition of airport runways, in our chart we saw that the secondary runway 1634 was yellow and green. Green is good, and yellow is fair. We have a couple of pictures which show our viewers what good and fair runways look like.
That's good on the left.
I think one of these is good. The other, that one just fell down. The other one is fair. And I think what's important to understand here is the only people who would like the fair runway, and not even people, would probably be deer that want to graze on it. And so this is indicative of the condition of one of our fair runways. So you can imagine what our poor runways are like at the airport. Now, David, you alluded to maintaining airport runways and postponing it, if I'm a small airport, till my runway is so horrible that the FAA will give me a grant to completely rebuild the airport. Yeah. You want to just take us through this chart, which shows how you can save money by spending money on projects at your airport before they become a real mess.
Well, you know, this is a problem with subsidies in general. They tend to distort people's behavior. If you actually own this runway, and maybe it's your private runway, you're going to want to maintain it on a timely and orderly basis, because overall that's going to minimize your costs over the lifetime of the airport. That's the right way to do it. Of course, sometimes people don't have the money. That's not really the issue at East Hampton. As I mentioned, airports had played this game of deferring maintenance in order to get the FAA to pay for it. So what's happened here and elsewhere is that you get way too far down that curve. By deferring maintenance, you avoid spending in the short term, but ultimately increase your total costs. And that's what's happened at East Hampton. Yeah. We have too much deferred maintenance.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, we're talking about pavements, and most of our viewers probably haven't been at the airport, but they have been on the roads in East Hampton and other towns. And there again, it's very easy to see what happens when you defer maintenance. The road deteriorates very quickly, and the cost to improve that road goes up astronomically. I want to take one more look at the condition of the East Hampton Airport pavements as of right now. And as of right now, there's no area that's red. But now we have another group of charts which are somewhat similar and shows what would happen to our already challenged airport if nothing is really spent to maintain them for the next 5 years. On this chart, what we'll see is the secondary runway that was yellow is now pink.
What year is this supposed to be?
I'm sorry, this is if we do nothing for 5 years.
Okay.
What happens if we do nothing for 5 years, let the place alone, maybe fill a crack with some tar or something like that so nobody falls into it, but really do nothing of any consequence? And what we see on this picture is our secondary runways deteriorate. Some of our pavements get even worse than they are today. And this is just a very short-sighted view of how to maintain an airport.
Or not maintain.
Or not maintain an airport.
Arthur, can I make a comment here?
Yeah.
Most of the public don't really understand what grant assurances are. When a municipality accepts funds for a project, federal funds, whether it's a road or whatever is fundable under federal guidelines, they have to sign what are grant assurances. And grant assurances are an agreement that number one, the money will be used for the purpose for which it was borrowed, and that the project will have a lifespan during which it will be maintained. In the case of East Hampton, where federal funds were last granted in, I believe it was 1998 or 2001, the grant assurance for the runway projects included a runway pavement maintenance program. Mm-hmm. This was a program that was supposed to be administered by the municipality, East Hampton Town, to maintain the runway. And as far as I know, there is no runway pavement maintenance program in effect now, which brings us to the condition that you've been describing.
I think if we remember back at our first slide, we saw that very tiny sliver, which was called maintenance, which was a couple of $100,000. To put this in perspective,
$25,000.
It was $25,000.
2015.
Whatever it was very insignificant. And at our meetings of the Airport Management Advisory Committee, we've had long discussions, and we've had a pavement report prepared to help us understand exactly what the condition of the pavements are and what the prognosis is for those pavements if they're not properly maintained. And these pictures that we had today were, for the most part, from a preliminary report. We expect to get the final report within the next month or so, and then be able to make informed decisions on how to tackle this big deferred maintenance problem. But to give you some numbers for that, the proposal in the preliminary report was that we would have to spend between $4.5 and $5 million just to bring back into fair or good condition the runways that we have right now and the taxiways. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude of this problem. What's also interesting, this is an operating runway situation that we have here, operating airport. And Gene, you want to just tell us how do you do all this? Do you close the airport down, or what do you?
No, there's no reason to close the airport down. The continuation of the
this taxiway here,
taxiway A here, should have minimal impact on operations, especially considering that most of the activity is concentrated within a short space of time. The problem that we're facing in the discussions in AMAC is the fact that there's only a certain window of opportunity that asphalt can be put down. So the preliminary grading and filling and surface preparation can be done up until I can't remember the cutoff date for the asphalt work, but I believe that the project can be initiated and completed before winter. After that certain date, you won't be able to put down asphalt.
What we were told by the people who have done this kind of work in East Hampton before is that if we want to stop work at the airport during the summer season when it's very busy, then we have a short window from the time it gets warm until Memorial Day to do all the work. And the advice we've gotten from Stephen Lynch and others who have worked on highways in the town is we shouldn't try to start in that window because it's such a short window. What Steve suggested and other members of our committee who've had experience with this also suggested was that the actual pouring of asphalt should begin at the end of our summer season, sometime in mid-September, and then be finished hopefully during October, early November, and it must be finished at the beginning of December because A, it gets too cold, and as a practical matter, all of the asphalt plants close.
Shut down.
So we have no other way of handling this except in that fall season. Now, one of the things we just mentioned was the cost to bring the airport runways back to fair and good condition. And now, at the first segment, we talked a little bit about Industrial Road, and this map here shows lots of different plots of land on Industrial Road. This is the orange ones, or the pink ones for the most part, are areas that should be used for aeronautical purposes. And we still have, with these parcels with numbers on them, are still for rent. One of the things that we as a committee have suggested is that we continue to rent the parcels rather than sell them, so that the airport for the next 50 or 60 or 100 years has a continuing flow of funds. However, we're also in the situation where some of the old leases gave tenants the right to buy their parcels. And as the new higher rents come into effect, those tenants of various existing parcels have opted to exercise their right to purchase the parcels. And David, we're down to about a minute, but why don't you just explain to our audience what you're suggesting, and I think most of us agree with, should happen to those funds from those sales?
Well, what we don't really want to have happen is that you get a one-time infusion of capital from sale of a property, and then that is depleted so that it's not available any longer to fund capital projects as the rent would be. So in effect, what we want to do or propose to do is put it in a pool that's retained by the airport and can serve over time to be a revolving fund where it's expended for projects and then recovered through payment of landing fees, so that we maintain, in effect,
A source of funds,
even though we're going to sell some property because we have no choice.
Well, I want to thank you both for being in our airport pavements discussion, and we're going to invite you back for the next capital improvement discussion in our third segment. Again, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to have you join us for the next segments as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur.